I sent a little resume of myself. I regard it as a big honor to have both of you with me in this recorded event. But just to say that my military career was in the Navy, the Royal Navy, and I specialised as a anti-submarine warfare officer predominantly during the Cold War period. So most of my military career was tracking, locating, and tracking Russian nuclear submarines as they came out of their Northern Fleet bases and down through the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap and into the Atlantic. And some of the missions that we did were specifically with the US. So I spent time off the US Eastern Seaboard with American assets in the Bermuda sector, again, looking for the Russian bombers off the east coast of the States. And ultimately, I ended up working for the Admiral Flag Officer Sea Training, training and inspecting Royal Navy ships in the subject area of anti-submarine operations. I spent some time in the Netherlands, teaching in the Royal Netherlands Navy Operational School in Den Helder. And eventually I had command of one of the offshore protection vessels. But about that time, I started to see that the military that I was part of was not heading in a direction that I felt comfortable in. So my career came to an end in 1993. And when I then started to speak out about what was happening in my own country, that led to me forming a media organisation called the UKColumn. I'm in the UKColumn offices at the moment, and we are talking about a variety of subject matter inside the UK, but also worldwide, and we do comment on the Ukraine war. But essentially, I'm warning that the Western nation states are being attacked. So that's a little bit of a potted history from me.
Well, I'm Major General G.D. Bakshi. I was commissioned in 71, just in time to join the Bangladesh war. And thereafter, I saw action, counter-terrorist operations in the Punjab. Thereafter, I led my battalion on the line of control, major skirmishes, Kargil. Then I led counter-terrorist operations as a one-star in Kishtwar for about almost 3 years, pacified that area, got my Sena medal and my Vishesh Seva medal, those kind of accoutrements that you get. And finally, I was the general officer commanding Romeo Force in Rajouri and Punch, again in counter-terrorist operations, major counter-terrorist operations. I've done 2 tenures in the Directorate General of Military Operations. I've taught at the Indian Military Academy, Dehradun. I've taught at the Defense Services Staff College, Wellington. And my final assignment was as an instructor, senior directing staff at the National Defense College. I did my PhD from there, and post-retirement, I am on to, the lecture circuit, seminar circuit, and of course, TV. Thank you.
My military experience isn't nearly as distinguished as yours. I junior officer in the United States Marine Corps, intelligence officer. I spent the first part of my career with the Rapid Deployment Force, training for eventualities, scenarios in the Middle East, in the Central Command Area of Operations. I then transitioned into arms controls, was the part of the first group of inspectors to go into the Soviet Union to implement the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with the on-site inspection agency. I take pride in that because I can say that I literally helped write the book on on-site inspections for arms control verification. After that, I got caught up in the Gulf War. I was on General Schwarzkopf's staff and played a role in what we call the counter Scud operation, trying to hunt down Iraqi Scud missiles before they could be fired against Israel. And At that point, I left active duty and was brought into the United Nations with the Special Commission charged with disarming Iraq. I helped create an intelligence unit and then an operations unit, and I led inspections in Iraq for 7 years, accounting for their weapons of mass destruction. I left that job in 1998. I actually resigned in protest, and I think my reputation since that time has been somebody who's been critical of American policy, not because I'm anti-American, because I'm pro-American and I believe America should be doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. Um, I'm not. I'm a very patriotic person, but my country is on the wrong path, and so I've taken up the task of trying to educate people by writing, by speaking, by doing, and it's an honor again to be here with you.
Thank you very much for that, Scott, and for our audience. As I say, I'm here to facilitate a discussion. It's centered around this horrific war taking place in Ukraine. But of course, in recent days, we've reached a new line, and that is that there is a clear call, a clear clamour that Western long-range weapons should be given to Ukraine for attacks within sovereign Russian territory. And of course, these attacks would place targets reasonably close to Moscow, in fact, under the range of the missiles. So from a Russian point of view, this would be weapon systems being unleashed on Russian soil close to the capital city. We've also had votes taking place in the United Nations supporting this, and we are therefore at a point where we seem to be rapidly heading towards a major escalation of the war in Ukraine and possibly towards a full-blown world war. Now, this to most people is incredible, but I think one thing that requires discussion is the fact that we have Western politicians, be it in the United States or the UK or the European Union, who are clamoring for this major, and I would say very dangerous escalation into the use of long-range weapons. So I wondered whether it would be a good place to start if we just set out for our audience, wherever you are in the world, how this panel, I'll call ourselves a panel, how we see the war in Ukraine at the moment. And can I start with you, Scott? We've got Western reports now. I think it was the New York Times talking about 1 million casualties in Ukraine. We've had the BBC analysts talking about 70,000 Russian dead. If the Russian dead figure is correct and the ratio of Ukrainian deaths is on a 3-to-1 basis, a 2 or 3-to-1 basis, then that million overall casualty figure in my head seems to stack up. Scott, what's your opinion on the real truth about casualties in this war?
Well, I think it's important to point out that General Cavoli, Christopher Cavoli, who's the commander of U.S. ground forces in Europe and the commander of NATO ground forces, speaking, I believe, in early 2023 to a Swedish defense forum, said that the scope and scale of violence on the battlefield in Ukraine was beyond the imagination of NATO. As I said, I spent the early parts of my career training to go to war against the Soviet Union in large-scale ground combat. We were prepared for horrific casualties back then. Division-sized units needed to be prepared to lose entire battalions in minutes and continue their operations. Battalions had to learn how to deal with absorbing 40, 50% casualties instantly and continue with the mission. But I think with the global war on terror, the de-emphasis of large-scale ground combat, militaries no longer train to absorb casualties of this nature. They don't train to expend munitions and logistics on a scope and scale that modern high-intensity combat requires. So I think the war in Ukraine has taken everybody by shock. When I say everybody, all those who are not participating in the conflict. I think the BBC numbers, to be honest, about Russian casualties are low because I think they are counting a particular category of Russian servicemen, those who are contracted with or conscripted by the Russian Defense Ministry, and it doesn't take into account, for instance, the volunteer units. Some of for instance, the private military contractors who played an important critical role in the first year of the war. The volunteer units and units of this nature, the Lugansk and Donetsk units that are still in the process of being fully incorporated. I believe, to be honest, that the numbers of Russian dead might exceed 100,000. And depending on where you are in the conflict, the ratio of casualties has fluctuated between 5-1 to 10-1. So I picked the median 7, and I'm comfortable with a Ukraine. When I say I'm comfortable, it's shocking, but I can accept a Ukrainian death figure of over 700,000. And then we haven't even talked about the wounded. The general knows this as well as anybody that for every dead soldier, there's several wounded soldiers. Some of these soldiers can be returned to combat. Many of these soldiers cannot be. So if we say a 3-to-1 wounded to dead ratio, and figure in half of those wounded cannot be brought back into combat. We're now looking at, for instance, for the Russian side, 250,000 men being removed as combatants, and on the Ukrainian side, the numbers top nearly 1.5 million. These are huge numbers. And again, it reflects the scope and scale of the violence that's taking place today. And the violence is different than that which people like myself, and I would even say the general, have experienced. The war has changed. The level of technology, the lethality of the weapon systems, the integration, for instance, of drone warfare and how drones have impacted this battlefield, is something that I can say I couldn't have imagined when I was in the military, and very few people can, because it's a new phenomena that's still being developed on the battlefield. This war is very difficult for non-specialists to comprehend. And the important thing about it, right now, most people, especially people who don't understand combat, know war from a book. They know war in a theoretical way. And so they're used to looking at maps, and they're used to seeing arrows drawn on a map, and they're used to envisioning war in terms of the movement of a colored arrow across a piece of paper. And then they look at the Second World War, for instance, and they look at the movements that took place both on the Eastern Front and in Western Europe, in North Africa, and Italy. But what they failed to do is attach numbers to those arrows. For those arrows to move, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of men had to die to achieve the movement of those arrows. It wasn't as easy as just drawing an arrow across the map. The military preparation that had to go in, we tend to have forgotten about that. We've lost that lesson. You take Korea, and that became a war not of moving arrows, but a war of attrition. You look at the final stages of the Korean War, the battles for the hills, for positioning the final demarcation line, and it was about grinding the enemy down, making them suffer more casualties than you. The war in Ukraine is a mixture of the two, with a less of an emphasis at this stage on moving arrows and more of an emphasis on literally grinding down your opponent. And that's the phase that the Russians are in right now. They have made a decision, given the lethality of combat. And again, I just want to point out, Vladimir Putin just signed a new act or order increasing the size of the Russian military to 1.5 million, approximately, active duty forces. That's an increase of around 600,000 since the war began. The size of the Soviet army at the end of the Second World War, I believe, was closer to 12 million. That's how they achieved those big arrows, 12 million. There's hundreds of thousands of troops deployed in Ukraine today. The numbers of troops here are not sufficient to sustain the kind of offensive maneuver warfare, especially given the lethality of modern weapons that we saw in World War II. So the nature of the conflict itself dictates where we're at, this war of attrition. In the West, I think people look at the lack of movement on the battlefield, and they say that's indicative of a successful defense on the part of the Ukrainians, that the Russians have stalled, that the Russians aren't achieving meaningful results. But the battlefield losses prove otherwise, that the Russians, in maintaining offensive pressure along the entire line of contact, are killing Ukrainians at a rate that is unprecedented in history. Because normally, again, the general can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but when you're planning offensive operations, you want a 3-to-1 advantage or greater, given the inherent advantages defense has in taking on an attacking force. Here we have the Russians actually, in many cases, attacking at a 1-to-3 disadvantage, and yet achieving a 5-to-1, 6-to-1, 7-to-1 casualty ratio in their favor. This is not the mathematics that is linked to an army that's losing. This is the math attached to a winning formula, which is designed to have the enemy expend more troops and more equipment than it can replace. So the enemy gets weaker over time, whereas the Russians, in maintaining this pressure, are able to replace their losses, both manpower and material, and get stronger. And the correlation of forces in an attrition-style warfare inevitably leads to the collapse of the defender. And I think that's the situation that we are approaching on the battlefield right now, where Ukraine is unable to sustain cohesive combat operations along the entire line of contact. And the Russians, by being able to sustain meaningful offensive military pressure, are creating opportunities where you're starting to see not big arrows, but smaller arrows. The Russians are starting to move the battlefield back. And this puts the Ukrainians at an additional disadvantage, because now they're leaving defensive positions that they have prepared since 2014, 2016, and they're moving into positions that aren't fully prepared. And they're doing so with troops that are insufficient to the task, both in terms of quality and quantity, troops that lack the training necessary. And again, the general, I hope, would back me up on this. A poorly trained soldier is a threat to everybody around him. Numbers in that case don't matter.
Scott, I think that's a good point at which to ask General Bakshi if he'll come in and give us his analysis. You've taken us through. This is a vicious war. The casualties are huge. Of course, in the West, we are simply not being told the Ukrainian casualties. I've never seen a war commentary before that simply doesn't talk about casualties on one side, but we know they're huge. This is a horrible war. And at the moment, there's no question that Russia appears to be moving forward on the battlefield. General, what's your assessment of the war?
Thank you. Thank you so much. As we see it here in India, we see a transition from low-intensity conflict era in the last century to high-intensity, long-duration conflict. You see, at one stage in the last century, we were being told all wars would have to be short duration, high intensity, if they cross the high intensity threshold. But now the wars are increasingly, the more things change, the more they remain the same. We are going back to the last 2 years of the Second World War in terms of the quantum of forces employed, firepower employed, attrition, scales of attrition, and even at the closing stages of the Second World War, I mean the early blitzkrieg were already history. It was artillery that was proving to be the god of war, as Stalin had so well put it. And you had these, massive battles of grinding attrition, but relentless pushes towards Berlin, all the way from Moscow and beyond, etc. So we see that the era of asymmetric wars, like United States fighting in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, all the lessons that we learned from those set of asymmetric conflicts, I think are now out of the window. We are back to the era of symmetric wars between evenly matched opponents, and that is leading to colossal, heavy level of casualties, as I think Scott so rightly highlighted, and so graphically highlighted. The fact of the matter is that in terms of offense and defense, we find that defense has once again overtaken offense as the more, what shall I say, successful form of war. The Russians used that last year. They built the Surovikin line. The Ukrainian launched their two very well heralded, very well advertised offensives, which came to naught. They just paid the horrific kind of price and casualties that Scott just highlighted. I agree 100% with him there. The other point that we see, because we have a lot of Russian equipment and we've been exposed to a lot of Russian military doctrine. In doctrinal terms, as Scott said, in World War II, from almost a similar population base, they had mobilized 12 million. Now they have been getting even to 1.5 million by painful stages. And we were wondering why. I mean, why did the Russians at the very outset not use the World War II Marshal Zhukov doctrines of mass and scale? First echelon, second echelon, third echelon, operational maneuver group, to overwhelm the enemy. And, like we were all thinking, it would all be over in 10 days. But what we found was a curious force restriction, a curious set of restraints, self-imposed constraints. And we were wondering what exactly why is this happening? Then we speculated that there is the Gerasimov doctrine of hybrid warfare, which is at odds with the original Russian doctrine of mass and scale, Ogarkov. And as Scott would bear witness to, he's been studying that all his life. But definitely the Russians started this war with just about 150,000, and out of them, I think about 90,000, actual soldiers really saw combat, apart from the Wagner and the volunteers, right? And they achieved their initial objectives, but then they came to a stasis where they had to hold almost 1,000-kilometer line. And they were painfully short. They had to mobilize 300,000 reservists and now some more, 250,000 more. And as Scott is saying, they might have to go up to 1.5 million. So I think this has lengthened out the war for them. They have destroyed the Ukrainian armed forces 3 times over. They have destroyed the Ukrainian economy 3 times over. But because of the NATO backing, because of the American backing primarily, financial and military, they are just rebuilding armed forces that are being destroyed sequentially. So where do we go from here? November is coming, presidential elections in the United States, and both the US and NATO are very keen not to be seen on the losing side. They started this war. They provoked Russia. They poked Russia in the eye till it was forced to invade. And now they can't be seen as losing this conflict. So we find a level of desperation which is now, frankly, getting dangerous. Ukraine was incited to launch the offensive in the so-called incursion into Kursk. And from the military, analyst point of view, I must say they did achieve surprise. at the strategic, operational, tactical levels. But then to what end? To what end? That offensive has been contained. It was not able to divert Russian forces which are homing in onto Petrovsk in the Donbass, and it was not able to hit that Kursk nuclear power plant and create some kind of a Chernobyl redux. So now they are being hemmed in from all sides. The Russians, without touching their reserves in the Donbass, have brought in their Akhmet Chechen forces. They brought in their Marines. They brought in some other special forces, and they have well contained this. They are on the well on the path now to cutting them off and to destroying this this fire pocket from where their fab bombs, their FPV drones, their artillery is taking a horrific toll of all the people that are now boxed in into the Kursk salient. Their offensive in the east, relentless, methodical, but steadily pushing forward. They've been using tree lines, they've been using small infantry squads dismounted. The era of large tank assaults, big red arrows, as Scott so rightly said, is passing, right? But the fact is now, with the authorization to use the cruise missiles, the Storm Shadows, etc., at all, in Russia proper, heartland Russia proper, Moscow and close to it, the Putin has clearly stated that the guidance for these comes from American satellites. And in fact, if these weapons are used, the United States and NATO are at war with Russia, and there will be costs, there will be consequences. I don't think there will be nuclear costs and consequences to begin with, because from the point of view of the Russian armed forces, if they can achieve it with conventional means, which they appear to be confident of, they may not escalate to the tactical nuclear threshold. But when you escalate at this pace, then I'm afraid you are creating situations of accidental escalation, unwanted escalation, but which could spiral out of control. And we all know that Russia has over 5,800 nuclear warheads. And I think that is an extremely sobering thought. But I'm sorry, we don't see that kind of sobriety in the Western capitals. We don't see that kind of sobriety. And may, as a nation from the South, the global South, tell you that World War I happened in Europe, World War II happened in Europe, and at the rate at which Western statesmen are going, I wouldn't be too surprised if World War III also happens in Europe. And with due apologies and tongue-in-cheek, if I may say, we get lots of sermons on reason and rationality, etc., from the West. It is the Orientals who are supposed to be emotive and loss of faith, etc. But I am very sorry to state, we find this happening far more in the West now, and it is reaching levels that threaten the rest of the world. They threaten the rest of the planet. It's time that somebody called a halt to this this slide towards Armageddon. It's dangerous for the planet. Thank you.
General Bakshi, thank you very much for that. Can I just ask, you mentioned the fact that Ukraine is really into army number 3. I believe that's correct. So in India, is the information about the true casualties of this war, do you get that information about the actual number of casualties on the Ukrainian side? Is this just censorship in the West that stops us ever hearing about the death and the injuries on the Ukrainian side? Do you get that information?
We tune in very much to the YouTube, and we listen to Scott Ritter, we listen to Colonel McGregor, we listen to a whole lot of very honest US analysts, and we have a lot of respect for people who can speak the truth to power, right? It may have its consequences, but unless we have that, we are not democracies, really and truly. So a lot of our information comes from the West itself. The official media is, of course, I mean, it's more for TikTok, if I may so put it. The media wars have been won by the West 100 times over, but on the ground, they do not reflect that reality. We are grateful to, American analysts like Professor Mearsheimer, and a number of others whom I cannot all name in this, but they are active on the social media, and that is a saving grace that the truth does speak out, does have a tendency to come out. We have Russian television also. Of course, you have to glean through a lot of propaganda material to come to that. But then there are Russian telegram channels which are also very, very informative. And there are Russian military TV, telegram bloggers who convey a lot of information. We look at both the sides because it is vital for us as military professionals to keep a track of this conflict, especially because 90% of our heavy equipment is Russian. We have T-90s, we have T-72s, we have the Grads, we have the Smerch, we have the MiG-29, Su-30s, etc. So it is vital that we follow this conflict and we get to the truth. We are not interested in propaganda. We are not interested in information warfare, narratives, build the war of narratives. We would like to get what is the God honest truth, because the truth concerns us all.
Yeah. General, thank you. Gentlemen, I put some points together which I thought might help us in the analysis of what's happening in Ukraine and how, in particular, the West is operating. I'll just run through these, and then I'd like to get you to comment. And am I hitting the right sort of spots? But one of the things that's fascinated me, General, you've just mentioned Western politicians, but we now in the West appear to have what I describe as rogue politicians. We have people that have been very active in Eastern Europe, seemingly to foment the war in Ukraine. Victoria Nuland must be one name that comes to the fore on this, but we've also seen former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson being active, not in calling for peace to prevail, but seemingly persuading the Ukrainians to reject bona fide peace proposals put to them by the Russians. We've got Antony Blinken, who seems to be a sole warrior to keep this war going. So one of the things that I notice within my own country, but I think this is also happening in the United States and inside Europe, is we have a very small number of politicians who seem to be running an agenda, a pro-war agenda on Ukraine, even outside their own political party structures. These seem to be people fomenting war who have no checks and balances. Do you agree with what I'm trying to point out to the audience, or do you see it in a different way? How do you regard these politicians? Scott, I'll throw that back to you, if I may.
Well, I mean, I agree with your assessment. Again, being a former Cold Warrior who spent a lot of time focused on the Soviet Union, I can tell you that in the 1980s and early 1990s, the level of expertise that existed within the Department of Defense, the State Department, throughout the United States about the Soviet Union, about Russia, was unprecedented. And this was during the Cold War, where I can attest as a former Cold Warrior, we viewed the Soviets as our existential enemy. When Ronald Reagan characterized them as the evil empire, you didn't see too many people objecting. But we objected from a foundation of knowledge and information that was real and realistic, meaning that we had a very accurate appraisal of who the Russians were. We may not have liked their government, but we had no choice but to respect their history and culture because we studied it. And if you study it, with any integrity, it's a history and a culture that must be appreciated. You respected the Russians because you understood who they were. Um, and the dynamic here is that you had this broad foundation of expertise that moved down to the lowest possible level, meaning in order to even enter into the realm of so-called Soviet affairs specialist, Soviet analyst, you had to pass a threshold of qualifications, meaning people wouldn't listen to you unless you knew what you were talking about, unless you could cite the history, speak intelligently about these issues. And then and only then were you invited in behind the door, and then you worked your way up. This meant that the people at the tip of the pyramid were held to account by the intellectual capacity of those they led. That you could not get away with saying things that were grossly irresponsible from a standpoint of historical fact and qualitative analysis. We were so well served by our Soviet experts, our Russian analysts at that time. You can have a problem with the policies that are made because policies are made not necessarily based upon the accuracy of historical fact, but upon domestic imperative, meaning that politicians will always do what politicians are going to do, regardless of what the history is. But the people who were advising were of extremely high quality. Then the Cold War came, and we literally wiped out that class of people. I was interviewed by the CIA in 1993. This is 3 years after the director of the CIA had awarded me 2 classified commendations for my expertise on Soviet strategic nuclear forces and arms control. So I would imagine that I was fairly well positioned as a so-called Russian expert to be of value to the CIA in an analytical capacity. But the head of they called it the Office of Russian and East European Affairs or something of that nature. After interviewing me, said we aren't interested, and I just said, well, could you please tell me why? I mean, I'm interested in self-improvement. If there's deficiency, I would like to know. He said, no, you're tainted by your past. You see, you view Russia with a Soviet bias. We don't want that. We want people who view Russia as the way we want Russia to be viewed today. We're reimagining Russia. Do you see what's happening here? They're no longer dealing with historical fact. They're dealing with a reimagination based upon a reality that they are seeking to impose on Russia, and that was the decade of the 1990s. This is where fact-based history no longer matters. Reality no longer matters. It's what's imagined. And in order to get this, the system imposes standards on academia that produces the experts that are fed into the system. In the past, the system demanded people with knowledge, fact-based knowledge, sound analytical capabilities. The system no longer was demanding that. The system demanded people who could fit into this reimagination. In fact, the more you knew about Russia, the more you knew about the Soviet Union, the less attractive you were to the system because the system didn't want the truth. The system wanted you to comply with the dictate of policy, which was to view Russia from the standpoint of what America desired. We desired a weakened Russia. We desired a subservient Russia. We desired a Russia that would bend to our needs, who would feed our economic greed, who would accept the fact that they had no ability to be independently politically, to be politically independent. And so the system creates people. And if you look at the people that are advising the leaders today, they all come from an academic background that I call the Putin whisperers. Almost without exception, they've written books and PhD theses on the dictatorship of Vladimir Putin, on the evil of the Putin regime. They diminish Russia by putting all this emphasis on a man who they've inaccurately described. So what happens is we get the Victoria Newlands, we get the Michael McFalls, we get these various experts now that are advising our politicians, and they're giving horrible advice, and there's nobody beneath them to hold them to account because the system that produces the experts is itself corrupt. And this leads us to where we are today with an inability to accurately assess the reality of Russia. So when we see things happening in Russia, we don't see them based upon a Russian reality from a Russian perspective. We see them based upon our prejudices and the conditions that we've imposed on this, we've overlaid. Russia must be forever weak. Therefore, we can't accept a Russia that asserts itself militarily. And we can't acknowledge that Russia has done something that changes the paradigm. So we have to interpret Russia's actions as actually a manifestation of weakness. And you see that as Russia is prevailing on the battlefield, the Western analytical perspective is Russia is failing. As Russia strengthens itself, not only politically from a domestic standpoint, but internationally, I mean, just take a look at what's happening with BRICS. We interpret this as weakness, not strength. It's as if, Orwell's double speak has taken over the Western analytical perspectives. And this is an extremely dangerous situation because unless you have a realistic, accurate assessment of your adversary, and right now, for better or worse, Russia is the adversary of the West. If you don't assess your adversary correctly, then anything you are preparing to do in response to that adversary, whether it be reactive or proactive in nature, is doomed to fail because you're not basing it upon reality, you're basing it upon fantasy. And that's where we are. And later on, I hope we talk about how this impacts the slide to Armageddon, because the one thing I will say is everybody keeps viewing this potential nuclear paradigm from the perspective of Russia using nuclear weapons first. Russia will never use nuclear weapons first. The biggest danger here is the United States and the way we've shaped our nuclear doctrine. And I fear that World War III will start with an American nuclear preemptive attack, because that's how we're organized and geared to do, because we have totally misread the Russians and we're giving bad advice to our policymakers.
Scott, I'd just like to throw this one in, and then I'm going to come across the general again. But a few months ago, I was able to interview a gentleman called J. Michael Waller, former CIA operative. He's written a book called Big Intel: How the CIA and the FBI went from Cold War heroes to deep state villains. And in that book, he was absolutely describing the breakdown in the West, in the quality of the West's analysts and their ability to look at other nation states and assess them properly. And he was also saying this causes us huge problems in the world because the agencies that should be doing their utmost for the truth and accurate assessment so that we stay as safe as possible are themselves now compromised and are tasked with just producing a picture which suits the current in-power political system. So he talked about a breakdown inside American intelligence, and he talked about it being steered to give answers that the state wanted in the first place. So to come back to you, General Bakshi, something that I picked up on was when you were talking to us, you said how surprising it was that the Russians had taken a lot of time to actually ramp up their military forces in order to deal with Ukraine. And this in the West was taken as a sign of weakness and incompetence. But I think that the truth was that the delay was because the Russians were actually trying to make the discussion and the debate work before there was combat. So from my point of view, I'd like to say to you, it's becoming very clear to us in the West that we are being so heavily censored in all the information we receive about not only Ukraine, but what's happening in Africa, for example, that we have to be very careful. So I'll just throw that back to you.
Thanks. What I'd like to say, there's a very interesting paper in the military writings of Mao Zedong, where he talks of the need for, subjectivity and objectivity. You have to curb subjectivity on the battlefield and be very objective and realistic about your estimates of your adversary, your enemy, etc. With the era of information war, with the era of trying to impose your fictive narrative onto the other side, you can win the war on television. The downside is that if you are taken away, carried away by your own narratives, that you lose touch with objective reality. I'm sorry, that is dangerous. In trying to sell a narrative to your own domestic audience, to the international, regional, global audience, well, you get consumed by that narrative. And when that narrative becomes so dominant in your own thinking, but it doesn't become dominant on the ground. The ground objective reality, the military reality is what I think all of us as military professionals have to, if we lose sight of that, we are asking for trouble. We're asking for trouble. And I think that is precisely what has happened. Apropos the other very pertinent issue that you raised, Russia, I find from the very outset has been very keen to negotiate. Of all the Russian leaders, I don't think there was a more West-friendly leader than you had in Putin. Frankly, he's been trying to reach out to you, and he almost at one stage said, make us a member of the NATO. What use? The Warsaw Pact is gone. So he's gone to that extent. He served for a long time in Germany. So I think he understands the Western psyche. And he, for one, I think is one Russian leader very, very keen to have a détente with the West. He would like nothing more than that. That is why he was taken in by the Minsk Accords, which, as Angela Merkel told us later, was just designed to gain time to arm the Ukrainian armed forces. Then, just before the invasion of Ukraine, there were a lot of talks, back channel talks, Macron coming to Moscow, etc. But these were all, again, we find a smoke screen. Mostly peace talks have been used as deception measures in the West, frankly. And then, we all know, April 2022, when Russia had achieved its minimal objectives, it had taken 60% of Donetsk, 90% of Luhansk. It had taken a corridor to Crimea, land bridge to Crimea, and it had taken the whole Ukrainian coast, less the port of Odessa. They had fulfilled their primary basic objectives of freeing the Russian-speaking areas, right? At that time, there were talks mediated by Belarus, there were talks mediated by Turkey, and an agreement had been signed. And truce agreement, peace agreement had been signed, which if Zelensky had accepted, he would have come out a winner. It almost though the terms haven't been made public, but the guess is that it talked of making Luhansk and Donetsk independent. At one stage, he had even agreed to withdraw from everywhere. As a goodwill gesture, he had withdrawn from Kyiv. From the gates of Kyiv, he had withdrawn Russian forces. That was immediately played in the Western media as a Russian rout. How incompetent the Russians were, etc., we were told ad infinitum. And then Boris Johnson flies into Kyiv and he reads out the Riot Act to Zelensky. You will not sign this peace deal. You will fight on. And once again, just before the Kursk offensive, we found a series of peace talks, back channel talks, and what would be the modalities of achieving peace, ceasefire, and the rest of it. Even our country has now been roped in, with the Prime Minister going to Moscow and to Kyiv to try and see if something can be done to stop this madness. But the simple fact of the matter is, I don't think the West is keen to let any peace talks happen. They're still talking in that Zelensky's delusional terms of victory in Ukraine. So, you can't be that divorced from reality. If you are, then I think that is psychotic. That's a bit psychotic. Bluntly speaking. If you don't give credence to the ground reality, your fictive reality you will not always be able to impose. There is a kernel of truth, which in Indian philosophy we say is paramount. You can't impose fictive realities onto that. And if you do, it works for a time. Like Lincoln said, you can fool some of the people all the time, all the people some of the time, but not all the people all the time. And you have a global audience where a lot of the censorship is not applicable, thank God. So people can see things for what they are. And I would think that the real chance for peace will come only after the November elections in the United States. And that too depends upon the outcome as to who wins. And there has to be a level of exhaustion on both sides for peace talks to commence. But the problem is when Ukraine has been brought to the point of exhaustion and finito two, three times. But then if you rebuild the Ukrainian army, rebuild the Ukrainian economy from a scratch upwards, it could go on forever. The feeling here in the East is that they are using Ukraine as a battering ram. They are going to fight Russia to the last Ukrainian. I don't know what the next step is. One speculation is that when they feel they have exhausted Russia enough, then they'll seek a direct conflict with Russia. You are welcome to your cuckoo land. A direct conflict with a nuclear armed power. You think they'll tamely go in under and not use a single nuke? I mean, that's Alice in Wonderland. Thank you.
General, that's an amazing statement, one that I agree. You're using the word psychotic when you are talking about Western politics. It seems to me that we've got to this stage. And Scott, before you give us your take on it, the other thing that's in my head, of course, is many documents pointing to what the West intended to do. We've had the RAND document, I think it was from 2018, where it was talking about overextending Russia, putting pressure on Russia and overextending Russia to help bring about essentially a regime change in Russia. We've also had recently the Institute for the Study of War calmly saying, well, we actually need the fighting because NATO's lost the ability to fight, and therefore the Ukrainian conflict represents an opportunity for NATO to learn how to fight. And it goes on in that particular report to talk about it being absolutely encouraged that the Ukrainians should experiment in what they do on the battlefield and in their attacks on Russia in order that NATO can learn. These are amazingly callous positions for the West to adopt.
I'll just point out real quick the fallacy of that. In general, you are a combat veteran, so maybe you can either agree with me or contradict me on this one. The transition from peacetime to wartime military isn't so much about the muscle memory of the basic tasks. We know how to drive tanks. We know how to fire artillery. We know how to shoot guns. But the biggest transition is learning to kill. The peacetime military doesn't know how to kill. There's a hesitancy when it comes time to actually taking a human life. NATO right now does not know how to kill. You can watch the Ukrainians kill and be killed, but that doesn't train your basic soldier in not just the art of killing, but the science of killing, the psychology of killing. The psychology of killing is the most important thing. The Russians right now know how to kill. They kill without hesitation. In the initial stages of this conflict, the Russian soldier hesitated and oftentimes paid a heavy price. There is no hesitation right now. When the Russians close in on the Ukrainians and the Ukrainians close in on the Russians, they kill instantly with lethality that's unimaginable. If NATO thinks that they're going to learn anything, I will tell you the ultimate outcome of the initial engagement of NATO troops against Russian troops. NATO will be slaughtered because there will be a hesitancy. They don't know how to kill. They don't know how to react to being killed. It's like trying to go into a boxing ring against Mike Tyson at his prime, having only hit a heavy bag. You think you're good. You can hit a heavy bag. Wow. But when the bag punches back, and it punches back with the skill and the lethality of a Mike Tyson punch, you get knocked out. And if NATO goes up against Russia today, it will be a knockout almost immediately because NATO doesn't know how to kill. They're not programmed to kill. They're programmed for the theory of killing. But the difference between theory of killing and the reality of killing is like night and day. And so I think it's, again, part of this psychosis that the general has accurately said that has infected the West. The notion that we can sit back and vicariously watch the Ukrainians engage the Russians and pretend that we now can do what the Ukrainians are doing is absurd.
Yeah. I want to just bring in a little bit more on the fact that we are so heavily censored in the West as to what we can read and understand about this conflict and the origins of the conflict. And I've got to turn to two things. One is certainly the BBC. I think the UK is unique in having such a single powerful media base that the BBC represents. I'm not sure what the budget is now, about 8 billion or more. And of course, with a worldwide reach to, in fact, billions of people when it's going. But the BBC is producing biased reporting on the conflict in Ukraine. And one of the reasons, one of the ways it's able to do this is by the fact that the BBC has made it its business to train young journalists worldwide, to essentially be offering them scholarships to teach them how media should work. And many of these young people are immediately sucked in to this relationship with the BBC. And of course, they adopt the BBC's views and values from the very beginning of their media training. So, for example, I can see reports that are given to the UK public from the BBC, but when you look at the journalists who produce them, they're young people who are living in Ukraine, or they're now outside Ukraine, and they're not giving you a Ukrainian viewpoint. They're giving you perhaps a Ukrainian viewpoint with the BBC's agenda smeared over the top of it. And in addition, and I'll come to the UKColumn, speaking for the UKColumn in our reports, we've also highlighted to people that the BBC has operated a charity called BBC Media Action, where that charity has not only been building these media relationships with young people inside all sorts of countries, not only in Eastern Europe and but in the Middle East, but they've also boasted about the fact that the BBC people, have been working with dissenters inside countries in order to help promote unrest. And one of the key statements was from a lady called Julia Harkin from BBC Media Action, who boasted in public material that the BBC had been working with people inside Syria who were standing up against the government in order to assist what they were doing. I was stunned when I first discovered this, but this then shows that we've got the BBC, which is clearly a worldwide media system, skewing the reporting about dissent and trouble and unrest in countries, but also with Ukraine in the fomenting of a war. And as somebody who lives in Ukraine, as somebody who lives in UK, and as somebody who's British, I find this so dangerous that so many people in the world listen to the BBC thinking they're getting unbiased news, but what they're actually getting is highly skewed, highly biased news in order to keep the government's agenda going. Scott, I'll throw that back to you. You've got a different situation in the States, because although you might have bias in the media, at least you've got different media organizations, and sometimes the cracks show where they're not telling the truth. But for us in UK, the BBC is all pervasive in telling the people what they must believe.
Well, in the United States, even though we don't have, it's I think, a false perception of diversity when you look at the different media groups. We have a situation where American journalism, first of all, has been co-opted by corporate interests. So for instance, when you say NBC, I think it's General Electric that owns it. You say ABC, it's Disney. And these corporations exist to entertain and make money. They don't exist to inform. We have to start off with that. The second thing is the confluence of corporate interests and government interests now are one and the same, especially when we speak of military industry, to the extent that we can almost speak of a level of fascism that exists in the United States, especially when it comes to information. And this has manifested itself in several dangerous ways. You know, John F. Kennedy gave a great speech back in April of 1961 to the American Newspaper Publishers Association. And there he gives just a staunch defense of the necessity of free speech and a free press, implying that the republic, the constitutional republic, cannot survive without a critical press. But today, we being the United States government, doesn't want a critical press. It wants a compliant press, and it's doing things to ensure compliance by bringing to bear the power of the nation, both in terms of law enforcement and the judiciary and the legislative branch. There have been a couple interesting legal cases in the last couple of years that underscore what I'm saying. One, look at the case of the Uhuru Three. It's the Uhuru Three is a black nationalist group. Most Americans wouldn't identify them, wouldn't know who they were, and that's why the government went at them to establish certain legal precedences. In the prosecution of the Uhuru Three, the government sought to criminalize what we call disinformation. Now, I think the average person, when hearing disinformation, would say, well, that's something that's not true. That disinformation is information designed to be different than the truth, to create its own facts. No, the government has acknowledged that you can be guilty of disinformation by telling the truth if your truth is different than the narrative approved by the government. This is in the United States of America, where we embrace free speech and a free press. The government has sought to make it part of the legal precedent that disinformation cannot be judged based upon truth or accuracy, but on conformity to the government narrative. This is extremely disturbing because, again, when we speak of how you shape public opinion, most Americans hear disinformation and they think that means that you're not being accurate. But the reality is, from the government perspective, as pursued in the courts of the United States, disinformation is information that deviates from the official narrative. There's a second case involving RFK Jr., where he has successfully got an injunction against the Biden administration in their attempts to limit his free speech. There's a new term now. It's not misinformation or disinformation. The new term that the US government has put out there, which has been absorbed by the courts, is malinformation. Malinformation is information that the government acknowledges to be truthful, but the truth is inconvenient to the government and therefore deserves to be suppressed. Again, I'm talking about the United States of America today. I'm not talking about McCarthyism in the past. I'm not talking about Nixonian, assault on free speech. I'm talking about the United States today as it exists. The truth is the enemy, and corporate media has bought into that notion, meaning that you will not get airtime or print space, column inches in mainstream media if you base what you're doing on truth, on accuracy. You will only gain access to the mainstream media if you conform to the narrative approved by the US government. The United States government is the greatest practitioner of misinforming the American people, of deceptive work. And this has been proven over and over again. Recently, we had a situation early on, I believe in April of 2022, early on in this conflict between Russia and Ukraine, where the U.S. government, in order to get ahead of the Russian narrative, would declassify intelligence information that it knew was not accurate, meaning they know this information isn't true, but they would declassify it and give it to the media, and the media would run with it to get ahead of the Russian narrative. Now, I have no problem with getting ahead of the narrative of my opponent as long as my narrative is fact-based and sound. But when you, in order to get ahead of the narrative of your opponent, have to promulgate lies and misinformation and deceptive information, that implies that your opponent is actually on the right side of history. And that's where we stand today. The Russians are, in fact, while not perfect, they are more on the side of history in terms of fact-based analysis and historical relevance than we are. And it's because of the media and those who dare speak out, and I have to count myself amongst them, are intimidated. The U.S. government has sought to intimidate me and hundreds of others, thousands of others, who speak out on Ukraine in a couple of ways. One, the State Department colludes with a Ukrainian governmental entity, the Center for Countering Disinformation. It works underneath the Office of the Presidency. The State Department funds it, advises it, helps it create its product. And one of the first products produced was a blacklist in which prominent American critics of Ukrainian policy were listed on this blacklist. That would never be allowed to happen in the United States, but American money and American advice has created a blacklist in Ukraine, which is then used against us. For instance, the Department of Justice authorized the FBI to raid my house on August 7th, based upon probable cause that was derived from some unknown source. Well, the probable cause comes from the U.S. government itself by either the State Department or Department of Justice. But what is the original sourcing of this? It's the Ukrainian government feeding to the State Department objections of my reporting, Ukrainian intelligence feeding to the Department of Justice objections of my reporting, and then the Department of Justice says there's probable cause that I'm what? Disseminating Russian disinformation. But I just told you that Russian disinformation, if you use the analytical framework I put up with, is the most accurate fact-based information out there. And for somebody who believes that it is incumbent upon all journalists, especially American journalists, to give the American public the most accurate information, fact-based information, with the best analytical framework, then I plead guilty to the charges of the government. But they seek to intimidate me, to silence me. We speak of the need to understand the Russian perspective. I went on two very lengthy trips to Russia in the last year, where I was able to observe every aspect of Russian society, from the political to the economic, the social, and the military, including a trip to the Donbass, Lugansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Crimea. My observations were, helped inform me and whomever I send my information to about the reality of Russia. The U.S. government has taken umbrage against this. Again, what I said earlier about my days as a Cold Warrior, what I did in Russia would have been embraced wildly back then. People would have sat me down. I would be speaking to the CIA. I would be speaking to the Defense intelligence agency. I'd be speaking to the State Department. I'd be invited to speak at Harvard, at Yale, in Stanford, at Georgetown, because people would be desperate for the insights that would be derived from such close and intimate contact with Russians at every level. Instead, they silenced me. They prohibited me going back for a third trip this summer by seizing my passport, and now they're seeking to intimidate me from talking about Russia. This is not how we inform a public. This is not how we empower a democracy. This is how we facilitate autocracy, dictatorship, plutocracy, fascism. And sadly, that's the direction I believe my country is headed on.
General Bakshi, your response on this is a particularly pertinent point, because what Scott's describing, we're seeing happening here in Ukraine, in UK. You dare to speak out and to challenge the government's policy on anything, but particularly war in Ukraine, and you are to be watched, you're to be spied upon, you're to be stopped at airports. Is this reality of life in the West, is this fully understood in India?
No, very certainly, because we very closely study the literature that comes out from the United States, from Pentagon, especially, since Duane Andrews and, net assessment methodology started. And then we had this whole wave of information warfare, narrative warfare, psychological operations. All that we say, I don't think it's very new, except that the sophistication, levels of sophistication and the forms have changed. World War II, we had the, BBC and Berlin and Tokyo rose, hammering you with propaganda. And the advantage they had was that then there was no social media. Today, fortunately, we have a social media, alt kind of a media, on which people like Scott Ritter, like Colonel McGregor, can, still sway opinions towards the factual basis. We have Professor Mearsheimer talking. Let's not forget, we had Henry Kissinger himself saying it should be standard maxim for American foreign policy never to take on more than one major Asian power at a time. And they have taken on both. I mean, they are pushing on both the fronts, with the Russians, as well as almost enticing the Chinese to act against Taiwan or against Southeast Asia, South China Sea, etc. So the fact of the matter is, we will have to create a constituency that for the truth, because like I said, the truth concerns us all is more than a truism. Let me state a few simple facts. The Indian perspective on the Ukrainian conflict. We need the truth. We do not need narratives either of this side or that side, because there are hard dollar decisions to be based on that. How do we retrofit our T-72s? How do we need to retrofit the T-90s? What do we do with our Russian era equipment? We need the truth to come to decisions which are viable, right? And for that truth constituency, I find fortunately it has gone to the social media. Though even in the social media, there is such a heavy level of influence operations ongoing that when you have to discern the truth, I think we have to fall back on basic military knowledge. Does this narrative, conform to basics of the military knowledge that I have learned, that I have practiced for 37 years? And then you find that you get a feeling of being able to smell the truth, right? Or to able to sense or intuit the truth. And I think that is a constituency we will have to preserve if sanity is to be maintained in the global order, because in trying to impose fictive realities, like I said, you can do it for some time to all the people. For some of the people, you can do it all the time, but not all the people all the time. There is something basically spiritual about the truth. I don't want to get into a philosophical discussion, but the fact is, it is essential, it is needed, And we have to see where we can create democracies, can create that free space where a citizen can speak the truth to power, to his fellow citizens, and thereby, he can stop disasters from happening. Self-correction is a very major thing in a governmental organization, in any military organization, the ability to correct yourself. I find the Russians have it in very great measure. They have it in very great measure. And I agree with Scott. The only narrative that we are finding, which is fairly close to the truth now, is the Russian narrative. Whereas there are fictive narratives that are now getting so blatant that even the normal people are seeing through this. And that is what creates a space for the constituency of truth with a small minority like this, like Scott Ritter, like McGregor, like Mearsheimer, and I can quote quite a few other American analysts, and people were around. This man is speaking the truth. It is patently obvious, you see, and there is something intuitive about it, with the basis of your experiential, with the basis of pattern modeling. There are patterns that tend to persist. And then once you start identifying the pattern, it is easier to read the truth. And you can straight away get with that pattern analysis, get to the fact that what Scott Ritter is saying is far closer to objective reality than the subjective narratives that we are being fed with. That's all that I'd like to say, because it is a very live problem. It's not just confined to the United States or the United Kingdom or Europe. It's global. It's global, right? Because the Chinese, they have their own set of reality. They have just created their own social media. They've barricaded and firewalled their people from anything from outside. So the problem there is far more acute. I find democracies, in trying to fight autocracies, start resembling them. You start resembling your enemy very soon. This is what happened in the Cold War. And then we had McCarthyism and everything. I think it was worse than anything that the Soviet Union could have produced on the other side. And so I think in trying to fight an enemy, one should not become entirely like him. I think that is something that the democracies of the world have to watch out for. In your contest between democracy and autocracy, today there is very little to differentiate. I'm sorry to state that very, very basic truth. There is very little to differentiate. Both sides, mind control, control of the narrative, control of emotions, control of attitudes, emotions. That is the Psy warfare pamphlet I had to read when I became the Brigadier General Staff, Information Warfare and Psy Ops in J&K. So that's a lot of American good stuff that we read. Then we also called in the Russian and we got to know about Maskarovika. It's a universal phenomena. But somewhere the decent mass of humanity will have to see that we retain the objective of as close to reality as possible. I think that's what Scott Ritter is doing. He's doing a great job. My compliments to him as a military professional to another. Keep up the good work, Scott. You're doing a great job in keeping people the world over informed and keeping them close to the truth and not to fake narratives. Thank you.
General, thank you very much for that. And I just echo back to you. I found it interesting particularly over recent months, that I am looking and watching Indian-generated news reports because I can always learn something from them. And interestingly, in cases where perhaps the information is still restricted in its availability, I'm not suggesting it's being censored by the Indian channel. It's simply restricted in what information is available. But what I found refreshing is that many times the host of the news program and the guests are asking the right questions which we aren't even allowed to ask, or certainly we're not allowed to ask on the media channels in the United States or the UK or Western media. So I personally have been encouraged to see greater accuracy in news reports coming out of India, and that has been a very interesting phenomena for me. I'm watching the time carefully because I believe that we were supposed to aim for about an hour. But if you gentlemen are able to manage another 10 minutes, I have a couple of other points to raise before we look at some form of positive closure for our audience. Are you able to continue for a few more minutes? Okay, thank you very much. Yes, the issue is on money. And of course, conflicts cannot operate without a suitable stream of money to finance the weapons and material that's necessary for particularly protracted conflicts. And I've found it particularly unpleasant to watch what is clearly an orchestrated international banking cabal first of all decide that they can gang up on Russia to impose sanctions, to make unilateral decisions that they can hijack Russian money, and ultimately put that money to whatever use they feel, such as further weapons for Ukraine. And then fairly recently, and I've forgotten the senator's name, but there was a small video clip of an American senator with Zelensky. And the senator says to the camera without any sign of embarrassment, well, one of the reasons we need to continue to support Zelensky is because of the trillions of dollars of mineral wealth which Ukraine is sitting upon. And I just found this utterly obscene, coupled with organizations such as BlackRock talking about what land, what assets they've already taken control of in Ukraine. I also see this aspect that the Ukrainians themselves are being deceived by the real nature of the support that the Western society is giving them. So I'll throw that to you, Scott. This is a personal opinion, so I'm very happy to be told I'm wrong here, but there is something about the power of the international banking system which I'm deeply uncomfortable with.
Well, you have every right to be uncomfortable with it. First of all, the international banking system, and again, I have to be careful here and acknowledge what I know and what I don't know. I'm not an economist. I'm not a banker. And I don't want to pretend that I am one, but I am somebody familiar with geopolitics. And when you look at if you look at the national security strategy of the United States promulgated by the Biden administration early on, one of the things they say straight up is that the number one priority of the United States is to preserve the rules-based international order. That is what we put out there is, the highest aspiration apparently the world can aspire to is to be part of the rules-based international order. But the rules-based international order is simply a system imposed on the world by a victorious United States at the end of the Second World War, and then continued after the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the Cold War. It's designed to preserve American control, American hegemony. And one of the things that we use in this rules-based international order is the international banking system. It's an American-controlled banking system. I mean, there's conspiracy theorists that can talk about the Rothschilds, and they can talk about the Swiss, and they can talk about that. But from a policy direction standpoint, it is responsive to American directives. The World Bank, and institutions of this nature, even private banking institutions, they work in concert with policy directions derived from the United States through the rules-based international order, and so it's inherently corrupt because, first of all, it's only serving one nation, and this is I sometimes catch myself because what I'm about to say as an American is deeply insulting. But America has no friends. America only has pieces on a board that we move around to best serve our interests. We will sacrifice any pawn on the board to serve our interests. Look at Ukraine. We're not the friend of Ukraine. We claim to be the friend of Ukraine, but we're sacrificing Ukraine. The senator in question was Lindsey Graham. And what's interesting is that I had earlier made a similar statement that a lot of what drives the United States is in terms of what it does around the world is competition for resources, resource mapping. You find where the resources are, and then you build the policies designed to bring those resources to you. Fact is, much of our Russian policy today is based upon breaking down the cohesion of the Russian Federation so that it can be broken up into smaller component parts that we can more readily impose our will on to gain access to the resources. We find it strategically inconvenient that the Russian Federation possesses so many resources that it becomes truly self-sufficient. And if Russia is self-sufficient in resources, it cannot be manipulated by American control of global resources. But Ukraine is that. I said that, and I was immediately attacked by the Ukrainian government, the Center for Countering Disinformation, for being a Russian propagandist. Well, what is Lindsey Graham? Because he came out and literally said, it gave voice to that which I had exposed. We're at that stage in this conflict where I think all pretense is being stripped away, and people are being much more blunt about what they want, both in terms of resources and in terms of objective. Again, what are the strategic objectives of the United States and Europe when it comes to the Ukraine conflict? It is the strategic defeat of Russia. That is their goal. They've stated. Lloyd Austin said it, and everybody has backed it up. They want to incur so much damage on Russia that Russia, A, will never again consider engaging in this kind of military adventurism. That's a gross misinterpretation of what Russia actually did, but that's the Western perspective. B, to bring about so much economic harm on Russia that it creates domestic political pushback from within Russia that can bring down the government of Vladimir Putin, allowing him to be replaced with, in effect, Yeltsin 2.0, Boris Yeltsin clone, compliant to the West, compliant, subservient to the United States, and then C, with that leader, achieve the breakup of the Russian Federation into components that can be more effectively exploited by the West. This is the strategic objective of the West, as stated. Now, if you're a Russian and you hear this and you know this, and the Russians do know this, I can tell you that, this is existential in nature, meaning that if Russia allows the West to prevail in Ukraine, Russia is signing its own death warrant. And now we come back to what General Bakshi said earlier. You can't defeat a nuclear-armed nation when that nuclear-armed nation is willing to use nuclear weapons to prevent its defeat. That this creates it creates an inevitability of Armageddon. So now we come back to money. Money drives everything. That's just the reality of it. If you can't do grand schemes without funding. And since the United States controls the international banking community, controls international funding within the Western circles, Western banks, money is serving American policy. And then it comes down to an issue of profitability. How do you make money off of war? And from the American perspective, we were warned by Dwight D. Eisenhower about the growth of the military-industrial complex and the harm it would do to American democracy if it started to collude with Congress so that American taxpayer money got fed into a system of enriching defense contractors. But in order to keep the defense contractors viable, you need conflicts. And so the American way of interfacing with the world becomes a nation in search of conflicts that will feed the military-industrial complex. And this is what Ukraine has become. In addition to being a testing ground of militaries, Ukraine has become a way for the West to revitalize their defense industry, which has grown stagnant because of the Cold War, et cetera, to try and re-energize it using this conflict as justification, and then the potential conflict with Russia as continued justification. And the only way that you can stop this now, because this is that very engine that Dwight D. Eisenhower was talking about, this corruption of money and war that creates a reason for living that is to the detriment of the world and the people it ostensibly serves, the American people. You can only defeat this by bankruptcy, meaning removing the money, or by defeat, the physical defeat of the hegemon that's using this system. Neither one of these are good for the world, because to defeat America is as dangerous as America defeating Russia. We don't want a defeated America. And yet right now we have a policy direction where America is defeating itself. This is the most dangerous thing. This is the point I wanted to make. It's not going to be Russia using nuclear weapons. The United States has created a nuclear doctrine and a nuclear employment plan that places a heavy emphasis on preemption. One of the reasons is the restrictions and limitations on our nuclear arsenal imposed by the last remaining arms control treaty, New START. We have to do more with less. So we have to make our missiles more accurate so that we can take out Russian missile silos and Chinese missile silos with one shot, one kill, freeing up warheads to be used in other circumstances. You can't have a one shot, one kill nuclear employment plan based upon reaction, meaning that the standard nuclear deterrence model doesn't work, because what you're saying is you're going to wait for them to attack us, which means they're going to be taking out our silos, or before we can run. And so we now are in a situation, in order for us to dominate the world, we have to impose over this a nuclear doctrine that allows us, not just in terms of doctrine, but also in terms of actual military employment, to preemptively strike in a non-nuclear environment. And so as we push to defeat Russia, and the blowback from the failure to defeat Russia results in the defeat of the United States and its European allies, what will happen is that the United States will say that the only way we can continue to survive is to preempt a Russian victory, and that preemption will come in the form of nuclear weapons, a nuclear first strike. This is the path we're headed on. Everybody's looking at the wrong thing. They're saying the Russians will not use nuclear weapons first. It's the United States, because Russia's not losing. Russia will use nuclear weapons if it faces existential defeat. But it is the United States and the Western Europeans, because of the failure of their policies, who are being confronted with not just the possibility, but the probability of their existential defeat. And if that happens, they will use nuclear weapons to preserve. And that, to me, is where the danger comes from. We can't allow ourselves to lose in Ukraine. The psychology of the West, the psychosis of the West is such that we can't accept defeat, which is why we have this desperate effort to inject new weapon systems into Ukraine to change the paradigm of the conflict. But the Russians won't permit that. They will respond with their own conventional capabilities that'll hasten the defeat of the West. And eventually, we could find the United States speaking of the absolute necessity of using what we call low-yield nuclear warheads, usable nukes in the perverse terminology of American nuclear warfighting, usable nukes against the Russians, not respecting the fact that once you use a nuclear weapon against the Russians, they will unleash the totality of their nuclear arsenal in a world-ending Armageddon. This, to me, is the danger. So it's not just about the money, but it's about the consequences of the failure of this money to do what the world wants it to do, because the rules-based international order cannot exist without the banking institutions, which are rapidly bankrupting themselves in this conflict.
General Bakshi, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, certainly, but I'd also like to, start with the caveat that Scott used, that neither am I a banker or an economist, but the area of focus is geopolitics. But that having been said, as we analyze it in hindsight, the primary aim of this entire Ukraine imbroglio, was to provoke Russia into an invasion, poke the Russian bear in the eye, till it had no other option but to invade you, firstly by pushing NATO to its doors. Then he had outlined two red lines, Georgia and Ukraine. You violated them both, and he was left with no option but to act. Even at that stage, in hindsight, it appears that the grand strategy in the West was to, make him attack, and then unleash a barrage of sanctions, economic sanctions, to torpedo the Russian economy, to do to Russia what had been done to the Soviet Union in 1990, bring about its economic collapse. That economic collapse was, facilitated by Saudi Arabia, going on a reduction of the oil prices. They put oil prices in free fall in 1986, right? And that free fall led to the price of oil going down from $30, $32 a barrel then to $10 a barrel. And that is what collapsed the Soviet economy, not Afghanistan. I mean, we are very clear on that particular score. You collapsed the Soviet economy by a very well thought out plan. Andy Marshall and the others must be given credit for their net assessment of Russia, its economic weakness, etc., which was worked upon very well to bring about a collapse of the Soviet economy. I'm afraid that hasn't worked with Russia, though that seemed to be the grand strategic aim. A collapse of the Russian economy leading to regime change, Putin in full flight, a Maidan coup in Moscow, etc., etc. All that hasn't worked. All that hasn't worked because Russia, I think, sensed what was coming and they have taken very sensible precautions. The only people who have been economically ruined are the Europeans. Germany has taken a hit, France has taken a hit, rest of Europe, United Kingdom, they've all taken a big hit. The simple reason that they were tied to the Russian gas pipelines, right? And you can't uproot them in one particular go. The economic hit has come to Europe and not so much to Russia. And I would like to get Scott's opinion on this, view also on this also. I think one of the reasons for Putin's being so conservative in the use of military force, in not trying to escalate, is that he was trying to keeping a very careful eye on his economic parameters. That if they went down, he was down. And that is what he wanted to avoid. But I think Russia has survived because it is actually a private sector economy now. It's not a command economy. If McDonald's went out, they encouraged their own people to come up and fill the breach. And they encouraged China to come and fill the breach in terms of the other. It is because it is a privatized economy that they have survived, I think. One of the reasons they have survived. Now about the world banking system. Russia had put its $300 billion with American and European banks. And in one fell stroke, they are told finito. They're gone. We've taken them over. So what signal do you send to Russia? Forget Russia. What signal do you send to China, to India, to Brazil, and to a whole lot of other third world countries? Don't park your money in the United States or in any European bank. Take them out. The fastest means you can. De-risk, de-dollarize. You have imposed it upon us. American supremacy, economic supremacy, lies because the dollar is the global reserve currency. And if you undermine the faith in the dollar this way, that whatever you put in your bank is ours, rule-based order, what's that bird? So where is the rule-based order if you're going to take away just $300 billion and gone? The reaction you will find is that India is taking its gold reserves out of UK. The first sensible precaution that we could do, China has de-risked its economy from, this exposure to American stocks and the others. They're also increasing their stockpiles of gold. The whole of BRICS is now working and thinking in terms of de-dollarization. Rupee-ruble trade and rupee-yuan trade and yuan-ruble trade, etc. All that is coming in. You've knocked the bottom out of the trust. That is the basis of all banking. And I'm afraid you have yourself to blame for that kind of a thing. Restoring that trust would take, I think, umpteen number of years. I don't see that happening very soon. And like I said, you have your basic strategic objective of the West. You, as in the West, means, I mean, I'm not talking individually, but the basic grand strategic objective was to torpedo the Russian economy. In that, they have failed. And that is half the angst and problem. Now, when you face military failure also as a result of the impending collapse, military collapse of Ukraine, its lack of manpower, its inability to match military mobilization of military technical industrial resources, then you see the panic mode in which some bizarre scenarios are being, what shall I say, bandied about. And if some of them actualize, then the rest of the world, we all have a genuine problem. Thank you.
Okay, General, thank you very much for that. I have a lot, I have a lot more questions, but I think we also have to be fair with the time and the amount of time the audience has been with us. Can I bring you both back onto the key issue, which is really the thing that's prompted our discussion today, which is that we have now got the US, certainly the UK, and other Western countries pushing for long-range weapons, whether they're Storm Shadow or Taurus missiles, to be given to the Ukrainians to enable them to attack Russian soil. What should we be saying to the wider audience about this? Seems a bad idea to me. Let's qualify it this way. It seems just a particularly stupid and outrageous thing to do. We ought to be talking about how we stop the conflict, how we get proper negotiation and discussions going. But no, the US, the UK, and the West are pushing for these long-range weapons to be unleashed on Russia. What should we be saying to the audience that they should be thinking about saying and doing in order to bring some common sense to the situation? Don't know whether you'd like to go first, Scott, or the General, perhaps.
I'm more than happy to listen to the General. I'm learning so much.
No, so am I, Scott. I'd rather have you.
Okay, well, I'll start. First of all, we need to acknowledge that this is insane what people are talking about. The double standard is no nation would allow a similar circumstance to exist where they were impacted. A scenario that is ridiculous because it's almost impossible to imagine it. But Russia empowering Mexico to fire Russian-made weapons directed by Russians to targets selected by Russians inside the United States, and to claim that somehow they're not party to the conflict. I can guarantee that the United States would hold Russia to account if any such scenario manifested itself. I have to believe that India would do the same thing if Pakistan were to provide another nation with weapons, Pakistani weapons that could only be fired with Pakistani approval at targets selected by the Pakistanis. The Indians would say, then you are a party to this conflict and we will hold you to account. Pakistan would do the same against India. It is just common sense. But we have learned to hate Russia and to disregard Russian perspective so much that we are blinded by the hypocrisy of this stance. The other thing people need to understand is a lot of the Russian strategic posture in terms of bases, infrastructure, ammunition storage, early warning, command and control, dates back to the Soviet Union times when Ukraine was part of it. So the Soviet frontier was extended out to where the Ukrainian border is today. The Russians have always said that Ukraine must remain neutral because to grant NATO access to the Ukrainian body of land is to bring NATO straight into the very heart of Russia. so that weapons of relatively short range compared to intercontinental ballistic missiles like the Storm Shadow and the Scalp suddenly take on strategic imperative. They become a strategic weapon. So now, in addition, it's not just that the United States is giving Ukraine the ability to use American or British weapons to strike targets selected by the American and British, but these targets themselves have the potential of having a strategic impact on Russia, meaning to have a detrimental impact on Russia's ability to defend itself, not from Ukraine, but from the collective West. And the Russians view this as part of, and I come back to what I talked about earlier, the preliminary aspect of what would be a NATO American preemptive strike against Russia, a decapitation strike against Russia, which creates an unacceptable threat to Russia. And so this is why I think people have a hard time comprehending when I say that if you use the Storm Shadow, it puts us on a fast track to global thermonuclear war, because it's not just the Storm Shadow striking a target in Russia, it's the Storm Shadow being interpreted by Russia as being a potential to be part of what is doctrinally accepted by the United States as a preemptive strike against Russia to achieve the strategic defeat of Russia, all of which is consistent with the policy direction of the United States and the West. So we are literally headed on a one-way track to global termination if we allow this to happen. This is literally one of those red lines that I don't believe Russia can tolerate. Russia will have to respond, triggering cause and effect relationships that could very well end up in a general nuclear war. So people need to stop viewing this as just, another war-fighting capability that the West is empowering Ukraine with. This has strategic consequences to the Russians, not just from a political standpoint, but from an existential standpoint that can't be ignored by the Russians.
General Bakshi, what should we be telling people about this appalling situation? What should we be telling them with a view to stopping the sheer madness of this attack?
I tend to agree with what Scott has said. The simple fact is that we've had so many silver bullets bandied about in Ukraine, right? The first silver bullet was the TOW missiles, the man pads, that they would stop the Russians cold in their tracks, etc., etc. The simple fact was that you were thinking in terms of Afghanistan, that the Russians would take it over and these would be used for guerrilla warfare. But then when the Russians, as part of that peace treaty with the Ukrainians, withdrew their troops from the gates of Kyiv, the media was full of what a Russian rout and how absolutely imbecilic, incompetent the Russian generals are. They can't get their logistics right, etc. And later it turned out that it was part of the peace agreement that the Russians had withdrawn. Then, of course, we had the HIMARS come in. Then we had the ATACMS. They would win the war for Ukraine. I'm afraid in modern war, as we know it, there is no one single silver bullet. There is no single silver bullet that can give you a victory, not one weapon system, because even if you introduce it within days and weeks and months, you will have the counters. You had the ECM to jam the HIMARS, to jam the ATACMS, etc. The F-16s were bandied about as a game changer. I've seen no earth-shaking changes in the military landscape in Ukraine with the 9 F-16s. One, unfortunately, or otherwise has already gone down, whether it is friendly fire or what. Anyway, that's a minor issue. But this tendency to look for silver bullets, which will change the whole scenario. So the Storm Shadows actually have already been used in Crimea. They've already been used in that peninsula. Now extending them to the Russian mainland proper. Now you are hurting Russian, what the French would call amour-propre. Now you are wounding Russian sensibilities. Russia, too many red lines of Russia have been crossed in the last few months for Russia to take this one lying down. It is now Oriental loss of face. It is now Oriental loss of face, and that gets us into an emotive, cycle of logic. When your cold rationality takes a backseat. So far, the Russians have been extremely cautious, very prudent, and I would lay it all on Putin's. He's been very prudent, very cautious. But how long is he supposed to be prudent and cautious when others keep pushing the escalation envelope? That is now becoming problematic. I think too many red lines have been crossed for this one to be crossed in Russia without any much ado. I don't think that will happen. And that is the dangerous territory. The people must be aware. The public in general must be aware that they risk being nuked. Some Russian commentators were talking of putting a nuclear torpedo in the sea next to Great Britain and creating a tsunami. Would you want that? I mean, would you like things to be pushed to that, push comes to shove, pushed to that level that the other side said, okay, you asked for it, here it is, right? So that concerns us all. I too have relations in the United Kingdom. It concerns us all. And that is where the public discourse must now, add into this. Just take your mind back to Cuba. The way the whole global media built up that tension. Look, we've got to de-escalate. We've got to de-escalate. This is Armageddon. This is the edge. This is the apocalypse. This is the nuclear Rubicon being crossed. It was all over. Every household that had a television at that time or at a radio station, I knew what the stakes were. Do the people know now? I'm not so sure at all. I'm not sure at all. Do they understand the level to which this is being pushed in the quest for, even if you are saying we will escalate to de-escalate, you might end up escalating to escalate further. So there is a limit beyond which this logic does not work. We did hear quite a few threats, like President Macron saying that he'd put the French Foreign Legion into boots on the ground in Ukraine. It was apparent that was a bit of a bluff, a dangerous bluff though, but it was a bit of a bluff. But then some NATO officers have paid with their lives because the Russians targeted those training academies and those facilities where the Swedes were training the Ukrainians on using the AEW aircraft to go along with the F-16s. I think about 200 of them have been killed. And that sets in cycle another escalatory spiral logic. So I think it's about time that in this urge to escalate to de-escalate, we may have accidental escalation. That term was defined, was precisely such scenario. And if accidental escalation in terms of nuclear weapon usage is to be talked of, then the public has a right to know. Thank you.
Gentlemen, I'm going to say a huge thank you to you both for speaking with me this afternoon. I certainly feel from the huge amount of information and analysis that you've both given on the Ukraine situation that a really good start for people is to, if they're watching this, is to share this information with as many other people as possible so that a much wider public can understand the sheer madness of the proposed action in Ukraine. And to me, it seems very obvious that it's only by getting the real truth out and the facts about what is and what is not happening on the ground. It's only by understanding the truth that people can make a sensible and a coherent decision on what should take place in Ukraine, how the crisis should be brought to a close. And I think the other thing that goes with it, and maybe we've got quite a nice example by being here together, is that we need nation states across the world to work together to call for peace in Ukraine And this is now becoming so dangerous that we don't get any protection from being of one particular nationality or nation state or another. We've got to work together across national boundaries to demand an end to this conflict and a
Brian,
proper.
on that, could I interject? Because
Yes.
I would be remiss to not say this. This is a unique opportunity to speak to the Major General, but to speak to an Indian officer of his influence. Um, you know, you speak of the role other nations can play. Back in the 1980s, the United States and the Soviet Union were not talking to each other when it came to arms control. There was a critical period of time in the early 1980s and mid 1980s when politics made it impossible to talk. We have a similar situation today in arms control. We have the last remaining Strategic Arms Control Treaty, New START, expiring in February of 2026. And when that expires, the arms race is off. The United States has said that they're going to begin building new nuclear weapons without limitations. That'll create the Russian imperative to do the same. The one thing that avoided that disaster in the 1980s was the nation of Sweden. They were neutral at the time. And Sweden played this role of being not a moderator, but a facilitator of dialogue. Because the Russians and the United States were prohibited from talking to one another, the Swedes would have conversations with the Russians. And then the Swedes would have conversations with the Americans. And then they'd have conversation with the Russians. And they'd meet with the Americans and say, well, the Russians are saying this. And they'd meet with the Russians and say, well, the Americans are saying this. And the next thing you knew, we were talking again, we being the United States and the Soviet. India is in a very unique position today.
Yeah.
Indian Prime Minister Modi was just in the United States meeting with the president. I know he was there as part of the Quad forum, but the point is, America trusts India. They want good relations with India. Modi was in Moscow embracing Vladimir Putin. We have a leader of a nation that is welcomed in both capitals, capitals that today aren't talking to one another. It's absolutely imperative, I believe, that India take advantage of this to try and recreate the role that Sweden played in the 1980s to facilitate dialogue between the United States and Russia on strategic arms control. And this is why. In the 1960s and 70s, both the United States and the Soviet Union developed warfighting, nuclear warfighting scenarios, employment plans that were not without limits. And the result was 30,000 nuclear warheads on each side, in the world on the cusp of just killing each other instantly with one mistake. Then arms control came in. And as a result, we reduced the growth and then we began to reduce the size to bring it down. But more importantly, arms control created the confidence amongst both the Soviets and the Americans that we weren't looking to go to war with one another. And important things happened. Our view of nuclear weapons, our employment plans changed. We de-targeted missiles. We stopped automatically targeting. We had greater confidence in one another, and the threat of nuclear war came down to almost the near 0 point. And then, because of the fall of the Soviet Union, the change of attitude, arms control was deemed to be inconvenient. So America started pulling out of arms control agreements. And the result was that our nuclear employment plan now changed. Instead of having a 0 chance of nuclear weapons, today we speak of using nuclear weapons preemptively in a non-nuclear environment. Why? Because arms control is no longer in the dialogue between our nations. We need to inject arms control, and it needs to happen now. General, if there's anything you could do to advise your government to assume this role of facilitator of dialogue, until which time Russia and the United States learn to be able to talk to one another, because the Russians don't trust America, and America doesn't want to talk to the Russians, so there is no dialogue. And without dialogue, there will be no arms control, and without arms control, the world ends. I think India, I was just watching, Prime Minister Modi in Washington, D.C., and I said, that guy can speak to both Putin and Biden. That is a unique thing. He has the confidence of both men. Could we not make India the new facilitator of strategic arms control dialogue between Russia and the United States so we can prevent this slide towards nuclear Armageddon? That would be my appeal. If there was a way that India could find a way to take on this role.
Scott, I'd like to thank you for that, but I do think that is the way we are going. The very raison d'etre of the Prime Minister Modi going to Moscow, having detailed interactions with Putin. Then he went to immediately 6 weeks after that to Kyiv. He had detailed interactions with Zelensky, and now he's coming to the United States. Is precisely, I think, the beginning of such a role, the Swedes, as you put it, redux, in terms of which we would be able to convey, if the two sides are not talking directly, we'd be able to, convey each other's views to the next party, and thereby try and develop off-ramps. Very specifically, I think after the November elections, these off-ramps would be needed, not just by the countries involved, but by the world. It is like we have in India a very profound statement, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, treat the world as a family. And I don't think we will go very wrong, because at the end of the day, I find the differences between us are far less substantial than what is common. And I can make that out in this trilogue today. There's so much that is in common between us as citizens of planet Earth. Thank you. Thank you so much, Scott. It was a pleasure talking to you in person, and also to my friend Neil. It's been wonderful interaction. I look forward to more such dialogues. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian, for doing a fantastic job of moderating this.
Moderating.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you.
General Bakshi, Scott Ritter, thank you very much. It's been absolutely fascinating for me. And I'd like to say thank you to the people behind the scenes that helped make this particular interaction happen. So big thank you there. And to the audience, a lot to be learnt from this discussion. But at the end of the day, we all ought to be on the path to peace, because that's what the world deserves. So I'm going to thank both of you, thank our audience for joining us, and we'll say bye-bye today.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.